Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. As you're enjoying your lunch, it's my pleasure to kick off our lunchtime panel. I'll just keep talking for a couple minutes as you finish up your conversation. Okay. Please do continue enjoying your lunch. If you need seconds or anything, please go in and out as you please. But we would love to go ahead and get started on our lunchtime discussion. We do have a full day of conversations planned for you. Don't want to waste a moment. So this is our lunch session on the challenges for zero-emission trucking. We are very fortunate to be joined on this panel by three experts in the thick of these issues who will speak to us about the economic and regulatory landscapes that they're trying to navigate. I'm going to give quick introductions for our three panelists and then turn it over to them. The format of the session is, as you saw in the last, we're going to have some introductory remarks by each of them, and then there will be some free-form conversation. So feel free to start thinking now about your insightful, cutting questions, and then lob them at them rapid fire when they finish with their introductory remarks. So we're going to start off with Vincent Pallecchia, who's the Strategic Account Manager at BYD Motors. Vincent joined BYD after working as the Associate Director and General Counsel for the New York regional nonprofit, the Tri-State Transportation Campaign, which advocates for improving, investing in, and enhancing the area's regional rail, bus, bicycle, and pedestrian infrastructure as a means for improving not just environmental, but also equity and economic outcomes. We're then going to move to Daniel Witt, who's the Senior Manager of Business Development and Policy for Tesla. He is a 6-year veteran of the company, before which he spent another 4 years in the office of Senator Dianne Feinstein, addressing transportation legislation and a variety of municipal infrastructure and goods movement projects. In his current role at Tesla, Daniel works with legislators, industry partners, and other decision makers to address state and local policy issues, as well as myriad business development projects related to the promotion of electric vehicles and renewable infrastructure deployment. And last but certainly not least, we'll have Ryan Popple, who's the CEO, President, and Director of ProTerra. The ProTerra is the leading innovator of zero-emission battery electric buses. Prior to ProTerra, Ryan was a partner at Kleiner Perkins. As an early employee of Tesla, he was the Senior Director of Finance there with a focus on strategic planning, technology cost reduction, and corporate finance. So with that, we will go ahead and kick off the panel. First, Vincent, welcome you.
Good afternoon, thank you. I'm just going to run through some slides here, if I can get the clicker to work. Here we go. There we go. So BYD is a multinational company. We are working on what we call the 3 green dreams: power generation, power storage, and electrified transportation. We are the world's largest electric vehicle and rechargeable battery manufacturer, over 200,000 employees worldwide, over $16 billion in revenue in 2017. We've won multiple awards or been awarded some type of, I don't know if Fast Company counts as awarded an award, but they've recognized us as the second most innovative company in the world in terms of energy. We have a global reach. We are in 6 continents, in 48 countries around the world. We have a manufacturing facility in Lancaster, which is in the Antelope Valley, 450,000 square feet of manufacturing space, and we are actually expanding that facility right now. This is a shot of our line. We also have been creating a lot of jobs in Southern California. We have over 900 employees in California right now. That includes 700 manufacturing jobs. And zero is today in terms of buses and also trucks. We have several different types of trucks. Right now you can see some of our trucks in your communities, like refuse trucks. That's a side loader and a rear loader. And then we have different types of products for whatever types of goods you want to move. We have drayage trucks, we have yard trucks, we have logistics box trucks, top pick, and our forklifts, which have been very well received. Key challenges. I was asked to make a quick slide about this. We've been talking about this all day. That's what this day is all about. Infrastructure availability has been something that people have been talking about a lot. How much infrastructure do we have now? What do we need going forward? How are we going to meet the demand of all the trucks once they are rolled out? That's a big one. Another one would be, I wrote down overall demand because I wanted to distinguish that a little bit from infrastructure, just in terms of it's going to be not only a lot of infrastructure, but also a lot of trucks, and it's going to be a lot of demand. For example, like at the port, it's going to be a large localized demand. So that's another thing that we are looking at now. Customer size variability. Not every fleet is the same size. You have small fleets, you have big fleets. Customer sophistication, they're sophisticated in the industry that they're working on, but they're also going to be concerned about rolling out new technology because, like someone was saying before, logistics is very precise. And so that's another key challenge that we see. And finally, electricity rates. So someone mentioned before the PUC's decision, I think it was last week, one of the key elements of rolling out more infrastructure was also the rate case that SCE put forward to ask for a new rate where the demand charge wouldn't be exacted for 5 years, and I think it'll be rolled out slowly thereafter. That's a big thing in terms of understanding that as we go forward, we're going to have to think more critically about what it means to electrify transportation. Well, that's it. Thank you.
This one works.
Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Witt, and again, I'm with Tesla. Most people have heard of Tesla, but here's just a couple, primer facts about the company. We really do like to say that we're California's automaker. We are the largest manufacturing employer in the state of California, and that's happened just over the last couple of years. That's due in large part to the growth in our consumer fleet, the Model S and the Model X, and now the Model 3. We've purchased a solar company recently, Solar City, and we've ventured into the world of battery storage, all of which has been leveraging a set of core technologies around batteries, energy density, battery management systems, and so forth, in order to create efficiencies that enable for this transition to electrification. We've now been selling cars since 2008, and it's 2018. So we're now leveraging 10 years and over several billions of miles of data, and pushing that into the heavy-duty sector. We're exceptionally excited about this because the mission of the company is to transition all sources of mobile pollutants to essentially sustainable energy. So that would include, obviously, the medium and heavy-duty sectors, and we've decided to move to the Class 8 sector immediately because that's the biggest elephant in the room. It's not to suggest that there aren't many challenges with the sector and with entering this sector. This is not a sector that we're familiar with, but again, we're bringing hopefully a different knowledge base to it than what the existing group of manufacturers, is. We have a lot of learning to do prior to the release of this vehicle, which we have said will be around the end of 2019. But what I can tell you right now is that we've identified some key challenges. And my job with regard to the heavy-duty fleet is to try and set the stage for market introduction to be as seamless as possible and to be as significant as possible. Because my goal is to see the LA Basin's air quality made dramatically better by the introduction of not only our vehicle, but by enabling our vehicle to be a catalyst for the transition of the rest of the industry. our vehicle is not going to be much more expensive than a comparable diesel vehicle. We're talking about $150,000 to $180,000, which is significant for your average consumer. It's a significant capital expense for any business. But in the market today for a Freightliner Cascadia or so forth, you're not talking about a significant increase. And in fact, when you incorporate the cost reductions associated with fueling and maintenance, you start to see that changeover where it becomes even more compelling. The problem that we have specifically with the port application is heavy utilization but lower ranges, or lower driving ranges associated with it. So here's the case I want to sort of preface, and we'll leave it with for further discussion. But our two factories, Fremont and out in Reno, Nevada, represent possibly the best use case, this is just by chance, for our vehicles, because we can leverage the higher cost of a new vehicle over a longer range where we're getting the best benefit from the cost reductions associated with that maintenance and the electricity costs. Compare that to a drayage truck driver or a fleet that's operating within the ports who's traveling minimal distances and maybe making 2 or 3 trips, and due in large part to traffic conditions and a host of other factors, such that the return on that investment takes longer to achieve. That's going to be the toughest nut to crack for mass adoption. We will see fleets who have compelling reasons to make a transition to more sustainable modes of transport, make that transition because they have other value schemes that they're looking at. But when you're talking about a drayage truck driver who, frankly, they're the ones that are driving the oldest trucks that are on the road, they're not purchasing a $150,000 truck. They are purchasing a $60,000 truck. That delta and this very real issue regarding the return on investment is going to be, I think, the biggest issue. Charging and infrastructure comes secondary to that and is complementary to that. But ultimately, everything that's been laid out today is on the table and needs to be discussed. I'm just adding one more thing to fuel the fire. I'll stop there, and I'm sure we'll dig into more of this later. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ryan Popple. I'm the CEO of ProTerra. I used to work at Tesla, but I didn't overlap with Daniel. I'm a little embarrassed because the 2 Tesla guys showed up without their homework, so we have no slides. It's been a long week, though, and there's only 1 month left in the quarter. I'm also, ProTerra, for those of you who don't know, we're focused on heavy-duty buses, and we're focused on the North American market, so that's all we do. We do partner with other companies. Our battery technology is optimized for heavy-duty, high-utilization vehicles. So we've announced one partnership so far where our battery packs are going into long-range coaches from a manufacturer called Von Hool, who's based in Western Europe but sells a lot of the corporate coaches in the U.S. So our model is go very deep and get really good at one vehicle vertical. And one of the things that really inspires us and keeps us engaged at ProTerra is we do believe that North American, Europe, and in Asia, the city transit bus is going to be the first sector to move completely off of fossil fuels. In fact, we have some fleets that are already served by BYD or served by ProTerra that are completely off of fossil fuels. And while I don't know anything about trucking, in fact, initially I was worried that I'd gone to the wrong conference because I make transit buses and I used to make sports cars before that. I think what those of us who participate in zero-emission transit can help in terms of this dialogue is just giving you some of the lessons learned, because we don't know exactly what BYD's numbers are, they don't know exactly what ours are, but between the two of our companies, we're probably taking somewhere between 10 to 20% of the demand out of the North American market for diesel and natural gas buses right now and putting it onto electric. Now, what's interesting is this market has been served for the last 100 years by basically the same handful of companies. And in a traditional industrial market, it's not intuitive that someone would buy an industrial asset from a multinational like BYD or a startup from Silicon Valley. So the fact that I'd say BYD and ProTerra have as much market share as we do shows you how much pent-up demand there is for these products. One of the things I've noticed about at least the transit industry is there's a dangerous assumption on behalf of the manufacturers who think that their end user is a lot more satisfied and content with the status quo than they actually are. So I think there are companies out there that make diesel engines or produce diesel fuel that are quite content with that situation. But if you're on the hook, if you're on the receiving end for those fuels, if you've got to deal with the volatility, if you've got to deal with the environmental cost, if you're Walmart and your brand is on the side of that truck, I've generally found that heavy-duty fleets, not necessarily the one-off operators, but heavy-duty fleets are very hungry to diversify away from a dependency on fossil fuels. The other thing I'd keep in mind is while nothing happens as fast as we want it to in clean energy, for me, I've been at EV now for 10 years. I started my career at Tesla in 2007, and 10 years ago in 2008, remember I was driving home from work. I think Tesla had shipped its first 100 cars or something, and I was on the phone with my dad, and I was like, I think I may have made a huge mistake post-business school. I'm at a company that's selling about 100 cars a year. We make a high-performance carbon fiber go-kart that's got a 53 kilowatt-hour battery pack in it, and we're going through a great recession right now, so the number of wealthy people who can afford this little car just dropped dramatically. So there were definitely moments in 2008, and I think even going out to 2012 where pundits and experts said, like, we will never get off of fossil fuels, it's so hard, batteries aren't Moore's law. And I just look at what has changed just in the last 10 years, and 10 years is a short period of time in industry. And we're now in a world where batteries are in the low hundreds per kilowatt hour. 10 years ago, they were $1,000 a kilowatt hour. So there's a lot of urban legends out there that batteries are too expensive or batteries don't improve fast enough. Batteries have dropped 90% in 10 years. They'll keep going down, but the long-term targets that the Department of Energy used to put out, the aspirational targets, I hope we someday get to $350 a kilowatt hour or even $250 a kilowatt hour. The industry's there. So the underlying technology, kind of the core economics is going to work. What we've seen in transit is the early phase was very slow. We had to find those like very few unique customers who are industrial customers willing to try new technology. We found about a half dozen of them, and that was it. But when the technology started working for that first half dozen, a half dozen turned into 60 very quickly. And I think the fleet behavior or the industry group behavior for trucking will be similar to transit. Everyone's going to be very skeptical. People are going to need to shake it down. They're going to need to do their pilots. But what we saw in transit is that copycat behavior was very, very fast. So slow early adopter period. I think policymakers really need to take care of those early adopters, take some of that risk off their table, reward them. And if the pilots go well, if the product reaches what we call product market fit, the industry can actually grow faster than you'd see on a consumer side. Because we like to say, if an electric bus works in Alaska, it works in Duluth. If an electric bus works in Hawaii, we have electric buses in Park City, Utah. That means electric buses are going to work in Aspen, Colorado. And these types of industries form industry groups and clusters. So there's a lot of good knowledge sharing. So I enjoy or I appreciate being here, especially given that I don't have any port trucks. We do have high power motors and higher energy density battery packs, and we know a lot about charging. So hopefully some of the lessons learned from what we've experienced in North American transit can answer some of your questions for how this could work going into trucking and port.
Fantastic. Let me go up there so we have at least two working mics. Okay. Thank you all. I really appreciate that. And I also realized that I did not mention who I am. Although I do enjoy cultivating an air of mystery, I will just go ahead and say I am the fourth person listed on your slide. My name is Jordan Diamond. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Law, Energy, and Environment, which is the policy think tank at UC Berkeley, one of the co-hosts of today's event. So now we're going to move into the question part of the session. So I'll start off by throwing some out. This is less conversational with me standing at the podium, but I'll start by throwing some out. And then please go ahead and I apologize for this, but just go ahead and keep your hand raised so that I don't lose track of who has questions in the audience. So first, and Ryan started getting to this at the end, your comments on lessons learned and what that tells us about the future. If we fast forward 5 years from now, where do you think the state of technology will be at that point? And that's for all of you, but maybe Ryan, if you want to start off.
Yeah, well, I can. I guess I can give you my perspective on what transit will look like. But I think there are a lot of adjacent markets like school bus, refuse that Vincent mentioned, regional trucking. So it could be class 7 and 8 trucking, not necessarily little trucks, but trucks that have a home base. I think all of those applications are in the money for electrification, as in replacing a diesel or natural gas engine with a battery pack will pencil out in a high mileage application. There's an economic business case there. I also think what we're seeing right now is a proliferation of really exciting product announcements from very credible companies, two sitting to my right and left, but also folks that aren't on the stage here. I don't think there's much of an argument within industry about the future of this. So over the next 5 years, I think you're going to see every major OEM that wants to remain relevant in transportation developing electric systems. Now, announcing an electric system and developing an electric system are two very different things. Anybody can strap a few batteries to a chassis and grab an off-the-shelf motor. Looking at transit as a template for what trucking will be like, there will be concerns about power, about hill climb capability. You'll need a heavy-duty driveline that can stay cool at a very high power output. So 5 years from now, though, I think we will have products that have product market fit in most of these applications. It's an engineering challenge now more than a physics challenge. On the transit side, I mean, I think the California market and a lot Pacific Northwest, U.S. Northeast, Canada, they'll already be on their way. I mean, we're already tracking that 1 out of 7 transit buses in the U.S. has a mandate to go electric. So that's L.A., county and city, that's New York City, that's Seattle, San Jose, California, Foothill Transit. I used to be able to rattle them off, but like there's 10,000 buses need to be replaced with electric buses, and that's the smallest sector of heavy duty. So 5 years from now, I think you'd be hard-pressed 5 years from now to get anybody in some of those subcategories to argue that internal combustion has any sort of future market share, but we will certainly by no means be fully adopted, even in transit, because a transit bus lives for 12 years. So every time a new bus hits the road, we're going to be dealing with that thing till 2030. So it'll take us till 2030, maybe even till 2040 to completely clean up some of these sectors, unless we do something like cash for clunkers.
Thank you. Vincent, maybe you want to take that?
Sure. I would just pick up with something that Daniel mentioned before about duty cycles. So I think 5 years ago, people wouldn't have thought we would be where we are now. We have our yard trucks deployed, and they're already doing a full diesel duty cycle. We're also deploying distribution trucks, our short haul and drayage. I think we're going to see scale up in all of those areas as the technology develops, as we understand duty cycles better, as we work through with our customers. We have some great customers that we've worked with. BNSF is here, TTSI. And the customer is really important in terms of working with us to meet their needs. And so it's a partnership, and I think, as the time goes forward, we're going to be seeing more of that, and we're going to be seeing more rollout of different types of vehicles. And just one other thing I would mention is charging. I don't know what we're going to see in 5 years, to be honest with you. A lot of the bus industry is doing op charging now. So maybe we'll see in-route charging. We'll see charging hubs, because if, like on the 710, maybe there will be places where folks can go and charge their trucks in the middle of a duty cycle, if we get to the point where we can charge as quickly as we can refuel. And wireless charging. I don't know. I've heard a little bit about that. We've looked into it a little bit. We'll see if it comes to fruition, but who knows?
Thank you. Dan?
Admittedly, I don't have too much to add. I hope that we're talking about essentially completing completing the entire route as zero emissions. So we're obviously coming in the Class 8 sector, but a heavy-duty Class 8 truck is not necessarily going to be delivering final goods to a restaurant or an establishment. So you've got to get the medium-duty sector involved, and some of the economics around there, which I'm not even terribly familiar with, I think are a little tougher to pencil. So hopefully, with the heaviest sector coming along very well at that point, or there being a foreseeable trajectory in terms of the growth of that, then the concepts start to emerge in terms of how do you achieve an entire system of transport related to electrification. What I hope we're not talking about at that point is range. And I know that this has been a topic on some other panels, and it's not to say that it's not a worthy piece of discussion, but I think anyone who's coming into this, anyone who's coming into the commercial market needs to be able to justify its presence there. And you need to be able to attract customers based on your utility and your ability to have as limited an impact as possible upon what they're already doing. So in other words, I don't want the Tesla truck to be a limiting factor. So other things are going to have to be the limiting factor. You should be able to do everything that you were doing and do it better than what you were doing with your diesel or natural gas comparison. That's how this market is going to take off.
Well, let's follow up for a second. Thank you all for that. But on your comment, Vincent, about charging, what do you think are the key infrastructure needs to get to where we want to be in 5 years? What do you think the infrastructure needs are right now?
I would say one thing is working with the IOUs. I think the decision last week was huge. The way charging infrastructure, electrical infrastructure is developed in California is very specific, and if we're going to roll out trucks, we need to roll out infrastructure that can charge them. And I think moving forward with new rate cases, being able to let the IOUs build the infrastructure that we need is going to be really impactful.
So we've done several dozen deployments now in the U.S. market. We're usually doing 5 or 6 new electric bus deployments per quarter at this point. So we're seeing a couple frameworks emerge in terms of heavy-duty vehicle charging. The simplest way to do it, and we see this with the smaller agencies, is just charge it overnight, drive it all day. And in the past, there was a view that a plug-in charger was going to be a slow charger, and an opportunity charger, like Vincent mentioned, would be your fast charger. The capability level, though, that we're seeing out of plug-in charging is going up. Now, the opportunity charging is going up as well. I mean, we're seeing systems out of Europe that are 1 megawatt opportunity chargers. And I think there was a company that recently announced a 2 megawatt charger. That's probably a significant overkill for a bus, and a bus is a big vehicle. So what we see is for plug-in charging, it's somewhere between 50 kW to 120 kW for the plug-in cord, if that's all you're going to use. And you're going to have a one-to-one relationship between a heavy-duty electric bus or truck and that cord. On the opportunity charging side, some of the cities, what they're doing is they're putting in one high-power charger for every 6 to 10 buses. There are deployments like that in Europe. There are deployments like that in the U.S. as well. I could see for ports in particular, those opportunity charge style systems could be very useful. If you are kind of a tethered fleet, the automatic op charge model could work really well. The other thing we ran into as we increasingly electrified fleets is parking density really mattered. So if you just tried to take retail style car chargers and put them in one per electric bus or one per electric truck, you end up giving up basically square footage in a very constrained environment. It may not seem like much when you put in 5 electric trucks or 5 electric buses, but when you start looking at 300 and you lose 10% of your parking space, that's not going to work. Most of our customers can't expand. The other thing that I hope we see on the infrastructure side and is emerging now, at least on the bus side, is standardization. We are trying to borrow as much as we can from established standards that already exist. So the plug-in charger for our bus is a CCS charger, so it's the same cord that you could charge a Chevy Bolt or a BMW, basically most of the North American light-duty EVs, and it's a fast charger. It's going to go up to 120 kW. And then we're also looking for standardization on the overhead system. There's a standard called J3105. I think that's close to being published. I don't see any reason why 3105 wouldn't work for trucking as well. It's where the bus pulls under and a pantograph comes down. So those are the only two we see. We keep an eye on wireless, but we have not commercially deployed anything with wireless. The challenge we've generally had on wireless is we can't get the transfer efficiency to match conductive. But that's kind of the two flavors that we see right now. Plug it in or drive it underneath something and a robotic arm comes down.
I guess what I'll say is I think there's two different kinds of charging that we're talking about for two different users. It actually is very analogous to I think at least to the bus fleets. What would be overnight charging and sort of a sipping method where the truck is used heavily during the day and not in use overnight would still be considered supercharging for your average Tesla sedan. Conversely, on the opportunity side of the spectrum, what we talked about when we debuted the truck was up to 1 megawatt. And again, that's to prevent the truck from being the limiting factor and rather to incorporate it into the habitual nature of what drivers already have to do. There's only so many hours during the day that they can work. Sometimes they work in pairs to maximize the time that they can work. They have to take breaks. All of these periods that are mandated by other things in order to protect the driver are the periods of the windows with which we think that we can enable the charging of the vehicle. We just need to match the charging capability to those windows of time. So, in other words, in 5 years, in order to see that happen, I think you are going to have to see an infrastructure built where the trucks live based on their profiles and based on the driver profiles. What could get lost in this, and what I think is going to be a significant challenge, is that even though more truck traffic is being driven by fleets, large and even smaller fleets, there is an owner-operator segment, and the owner-operator segment is highly sensitive to cost. Doesn't have the ability to even install supercharging at 125 kilowatts at their home. And so there's going to have to be a public network that is established along the 710 and in other places, truck stops. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but we have to at least begin this process. And the utilities have to be a part of this, because every time that we go and put in a new supercharging station, that's a pretty substantial investment of ours and investment in the utilities capacity. So as soon as these start popping up in different areas, particularly in areas that have been traditionally lower served, like warehouses that only have HVAC systems and now are going to be transitioning entirely to electrified fleets, there's going to be a time commitment as well as a financial commitment that needs to be carefully managed so that this process isn't elongated longer than it needs to be.
Thank you. So we've talked about 5 years from now, where will we be? What's the infrastructure needed for that? The third part of that is, what are the policy asks that you would have? This could be at the federal level, at the state level, or at the local level. But what are either some policy obstacles or some policies that we could put in place that would help us kind of catalyze movement towards that goal? Whoever wants to.
I'll start.
Yeah.
So this was actually talked about on one of the previous panels, but the discussion of so money's going to be important. Money's important on the charging side. Money's important to get rid of the delta that I mentioned before on the return on investment, or for an owner-operator segment that traditionally purchases vehicles on the second or third round of ownership, because that's when they can afford it based on depreciation. Enabling those individuals and those companies to jump ahead to this new technology, I think, is going to be very important. That's going to take money. The other side of this, and it is related to that, is this bias towards whether or not we want the trucks here or we want them elsewhere. I can tell you from talking to the end users, Tesla has absolutely no authority in terms of where these trucks go. And these companies are going to go where it pencils as quickly as possible. So I'd like to echo what some of the suggestions were before, I guess, that there actually are structures in place. California is way ahead of other states in terms of programs. We've been focusing on this issue, and rightly so, for over a decade, a couple decades. And as a result, you've got Carl Moyer, you've got HVIP, you've got a number of things that are already out there that maybe need to be tweaked, a little bit. But ultimately, those programs need to be protected, and frankly, the values of those programs are incredibly substantial. It's predicated on the basis that new technology is going to be very expensive when it first comes out. We're going to leapfrog that a little bit. So, we're not talking, hopefully, about the entire cost of the truck being being addressed by an incentive. But I think it is important at least for this initial volley in the early adopters, make sure that there is a heavy incentive to make sure the trucks stay in California. And then to adjust these programs so that it moves beyond a proof of concept, early stage adoption, and really acts as a catalyst to mass adoption. Because I agree entirely with what Ryan said. There's going to be an inflection point sometime in the 2020 period, in that decade, where the economic viability and the reputation of these products makes it a no-brainer. And so you start to see much more massive acquisition of these trucks, and we need to be able to accommodate that in every form, again, from charging, from the vehicle ownership perspective, and certainly to make sure that the trucks that are being produced end up in California as opposed to Florida or New York, New Jersey, or in Washington and so forth. And they can have their share, but I think we as a result of our history understand how important it is that we start to reach levels of attainment or even go beyond the forecasted levels of attainment.
Yeah, so I would echo some of that. Generally, on the transit side, I think policy's been very good, and product has gotten quite good as well. So I think it's a healthy thing when you see the cost of a technology rapidly declining and the amount of help that the technology needs rapidly declining as well. So we see this at the federal level. There was a program called low and no emissions, and early on, the feds would pay for the entire zero-emission vehicle. So you could get a fuel cell bus or a battery electric bus. And so you could get a grant for $1 million, kind of an R&D cost bus. The buses have come down in price probably a third since then, so they're about the same price as a hybrid now. And the feds only have to offer typically about 1/7 of the cost of the vehicle as incentive funding to get a transit agency to want to put the other 6/7 of their money in the game and go to an electric. I would echo Daniel's comment, though, about watching the electricity side. We have the benefit of having transit buses in, 22 states now. And one of the regions that's really interesting to look at is the Pacific Northwest. By nature of how their grid works, as well as policy, electricity pricing in the Pacific Northwest is very cheap. That's why people make things like aluminum and carbon fiber up there. When you start moving goods and people on electricity, and you can also leverage low-cost electricity, you have a massive economic benefit. So a ProTerra electric bus operating on California electricity prices is somewhere between 16 and 21 mile per gallon equivalent. So that's 4 to 5 times more cost-effective per mile than diesel. If you go to Seattle, the same ProTerra electric bus on a cost-adjusted basis gets the cost equivalent of 45 miles the gallon. If you think about the impact on trucking and transportation, you have these fleets are hyper competitive, it's very thin margins, and nations are hyper competitive. I can't think of something that would generate more economic productivity than for us to be able to reduce the amount of energy per mile that we use to move essentially everything in this country. And the downside of not figuring it out is it would be if we don't electrify and other countries do, it'd be like our oil prices being 3 to 4 times higher than their oil prices. You'd literally be uncompetitive from an economic basis. So it's going to happen from a physics perspective. The best laboratory test of an internal combustion engine is probably in the 40% thermal efficiency. The worst electric motor is probably in the 70%. So worst case electric motor is more efficient than vaporware internal combustion or an engine that doesn't even exist. So we know where it's going from a physics perspective. What I hope we can do is wrap some of the broader economic and collective good benefits that electrifying transportation has into the actual cost of electricity for transport, especially heavy-duty transport. Because if you look at where the buses and the trucks operate and the type of pollution that comes out of buses and trucks and who lives near buses and trucks, it's a really uneven playing field. Or there's a really clear environmental justice argument to make that, I drive my SUV, but where the fuel gets refined for that SUV is an economically disadvantaged community. So in our electricity pricing, we're still treating all electrons the same. Longer term, I hope we can take things like low carbon fuel standard and recognize the fact that a unit of electricity that offsets burning diesel in an internal combustion engine actually has more economic and health and environmental good for the state of California than a unit of electricity that powers an LED light. I'm a big fan of electricity, but if you think about cleaning up the dirtiest stuff first, the thing we've got to stop doing is lighting things on fire, especially in high population areas. And the things we light on fire in California, transportation fuel.
I can just quickly mention two things that both Daniel and Ryan also mentioned was I agree in terms of financing is obviously going to be the number one thing. It has been. HVIP has been wildly successful so far. Folks like point of sale funding. Another thing that came up earlier, Denny is here, and Vision 2020, which is very similar to Measure M and Measure R, and Move LA was an instrumental role in getting those passed. And I think something that kind of goes between environment and funding is what Ryan was saying about we already pay for the cost of diesel. It's just that we're putting a number on it in terms of the funding that we need to get the cost down for this technology versus distributing the cost out and kind of explaining to folks, if your sales tax goes up a half a cent, what are you getting for that? You're getting clean air. You're not creating these impacts on folks in like the 710 corridor. I used to live in New York. The Bronx, the South Bronx is the worst polluted congressional district, and you just have trucks everywhere. And these kinds of things, the impacts that these kinds of changes can have, it costs money. But it also, the benefit is so massive, it's almost incalculable. And I would just say a related point is thinking about regulations and the regulations that we have on the books, can we do them smarter, differently, a way to keep up with the technology. So in terms of environmental quality review, it might not surprise you to know that if a highway needs to be rebuilt, that's a categorical exclusion, and that's just going to get rebuilt because it's within the right of way. But we know that that's going to have a massive negative impact on the environment, yet it's still a categorical exclusion. So thinking about how maybe we could get some kind of review of regulations, environmental impacts, so that we can say, well, we're taking these trucks from gas to diesel, from diesel to electric. So should we consider a way to reimagine the environmental framework around those types of vehicles, that kind of project?
Okay. Terrific. Thank you all. And in our remaining time, I want to turn it over. Are there any questions from the audience right now? Okay. I'm going to hear in the front and then second, I'm in the back. It's okay. And
I do. I'm Gwen Henry. I'm from San Pedro, right over there by the port. My name is Gwendolyn Henry. I'm over in San Pedro by the port. I do appreciate that observance recognizing a unit of electricity. It offsets carbon, the impact is more than a light bulb. I appreciate that very much. Sorry guys, I'll get back to you.
It's Friday. It's after lunch.
Okay, in the back? Oh, yes.
Yes, I participated in a lecture at the Chino Municipal Basin Water District with Dr. Berg, who's an expert in climate change here at UCLA, and he talked about our future of 10 degrees hotter, and there's going to put a lot of stress on our air conditioning systems to keep us all healthy. At what point, there's going to be a trade-off between, do we, 10 years from now, electrify our large trucks, or do we air condition our places for others for those that need it? How are you going to balance this? And then I've also participated in EarthX. It's a black sky event. What do we do in case of an EMP event? It may be two stupid questions, but Dr. Berg, he sure piqued my interest about the future. Thank you.
Sure. I think having participated in EV for 10 years, I've kind of watched the scary EV story always be 18 months out, and it's still 18 months out, and it's still 18 months out. And so I take some of that, concerns about like the overall supply of electricity with a grain of salt, because we've been hearing for 10 years that if you get 2 EVs on a block, the transformer is going to explode. And then if you get 10 EVs on a block, you're going to have to build a new power plant. We are deploying electric buses at the megawatt scale all across the U.S. And I can tell you, it wasn't easy to add 700 kW in a short amount of time to an antiquated grid in Washington, D.C., or 1.25 megawatts of additional switchgear into Philadelphia. But there is a massive industry that is already in the business of delivering the amount of electricity you need, as long as you plan ahead, and you probably need about a year in some cases for permitting. I don't think we're going to have a primary energy generation problem. And I go to a lot of the utility conferences because they want to understand what's going on in electric. The concern from the utility side is load is falling so fast because of solar and LED lighting. I mean, LED lighting reduces energy consumption by 80%. So that's just a catastrophic loss of revenue for the utility sector. So the utility executives, I don't know of a single utility executive out there that's concerned that there won't be enough, or there'll be too much demand for his or her product. The primary concern in the utility sector right now is avoiding the utility death spiral, where solar roof, LED lighting, and distributed energy cause massive blocks of revenue to drop off the grid. In fact, there's pretty good arguments to be made that if we don't electrify transport, the price of electricity is going to go up, because the electrical utility is a legacy fixed asset, and you've got to monetize that over as much electricity as possible. So I don't think we'll have a power generation problem, especially when I look where the cost per watt of solar is going. I do think we've got a lot of work to do on transmission and distribution. I think resiliency is a really important thing to plan for. I think resiliency of electric vehicle systems is actually higher than fossil fuels. We know this from experience of having fleets on the Gulf Coast. A lot of refined product gets moved around the Gulf Coast by barge. So when the hurricanes came through last year in rapid succession, first thing that happened is refineries went offline in Houston. The second thing that happened is barge traffic was canceled over the Gulf Coast. So all of South Florida was running out of liquid fuel. So it doesn't take an EMP or nuclear war to basically shut down our current energy infrastructure. One pipeline ruptures on the East Coast, and the East Coast is out of gasoline or diesel. What we're looking at is, how do you put in a lot of distributed generation? How do you do hardened microgrids? And how do you create more self-sufficiency? I do think the classic model of the grid is quite vulnerable. What I hope it looks like 10 years from now is that anybody who has a large fleet of electric vehicles has solar-covered parking, batteries on site, and I hope they have a stationary fuel cell so that they can convert natural gas into electricity in an emergency. I hope that electric ends up being more resilient than what fossil fuel currently is.
Terrific. Thank you, Daniel. Okay, terrific. We're going to go just a gentleman in the back corner, and then we'll finish up with you, ma'am.
Yeah, Eli Littman from Move LA. I'm really excited to hear the commitment to rolling out these products in the state of California. We rock. I guess I'm just worried, I was in Mexico City in December and you see these very dirty diesel buses running around the city. Many of them come from formerly used vehicles here. And so how do we, I love that commitment. I know that these are more expensive, but how do we prevent just pushing our emissions to the third world, frankly? And how do we prevent these old buses being sold by operators just being sold to the lowest bidder and pushing our emissions somewhere else?
All right, so that's a great question. I mentioned earlier cash for clunkers. There's a program in Texas. It's a 5-letter acronym. It starts with a T, TERSIP or something. But when they're trying to get their oldest diesel engines out of Texas because the older a diesel engine gets, the less healthy it gets. So when they pay for the retirement of a vehicle that no longer is emissions qualified, they bore out the engine. So it's a cash for clunkers type program. The downside of transportation is that your vehicles get used really hard and they get depreciated. The residual value of a bus after 10 to 12 years is almost zero. I mean, our buses get worked pretty hard. So they're not necessarily like power plants. They do go away. But I think, I don't know, I don't have many good ideas for old diesel buses. Maybe if we could take the engines out, we could do reef restoration and sink them somewhere. In all seriousness, I think that the engines are the things you want to watch. There are repower models, and there's a company in Africa doing electric buses by starting with old chassis. So if we do a cash for clunkers things, I think what you'd want to do is pull the engine out, destroy it, and then let somebody buy the chassis if they want.
Okay, and then we have time for one very quick question. Yeah. Oh, Daniel up here. Sorry. Remembered her question. Up at the front table. Thank you.
This is for Daniel. Have you focused on which niche markets that you want to work with at the ports in particular to maximize the success of the early adopter program and create the most success and the most buzz? And, I'm sorry, regarding the infrastructure around the ports, there's a lot of improvements being done, a lot of workflow, off-ramps, and that kind of thing. How involved are you in that, all of you? Do you have any input? And as far as charging stations and that kind of flow of the traffic, of the trucks, are you providing any input with the ports and collaborating in that?
So I think I mentioned this kind of off the top. I think the use case for the trucks that are coming in and out of the port is actually one of the tougher cases to make. But there's the biggest value to be extracted from it from an air quality emissions standpoint, certainly for the local community. So this is a policy issue at the root of it, because the truck is going to cost what it's going to cost, and the drivers are going to pay what they're going to pay. So that's the delta that I keep talking about, and that we're going to have to work out. So we're very interested in coming to a solution around that regard. And again, there's funding sources and that are already in existence. So it's a matter, for one thing, we have to fulfill our promise to actually bring this truck to market. So the proof is in the pudding. And we're going to have to, and so the onus is on us to actually fulfill everything that I'm promising at this point. But provided that we can do that, it's going to take, I think, a little bit of time for everybody to get their skis under them to have this working, in an efficient manner. So I guess what I would submit is that, there's been a lot of interest in a zero-emission truck. We get a lot of inquiries at this point. We are most interested in working with fleets because they're not talking about buying one or two. They're talking about buying 10 or 50 or more. And so for us as the manufacturer, that's important in order to be able to justify the resources that we're going to put into the actual manufacturing. That commitment and that lowering of risk will enable us to build more that will end up with owner operators and single purchase fleets, for instance. So it's all to say, I think this is still coming together. We want to be very clear about what we think the issues are so that, again, when this product comes out, there's answers and solutions that are being developed for it. And this goes directly to the charging, the second part of your question with regard to the charging infrastructure. Again, when we're talking about a vehicle that goes 250 or 500 miles carrying 80,000 pounds, I don't know that it's, I think you need to be more strategic about setting up a network of charging infrastructure rather than just firing a buckshot. I think that it may be worth it to have charging on the port, but again, if you're only getting 2, maybe 3 turns in a given day, are you going to step out of your queue line to get your goods in order to charge your truck? Not unless it's absolutely necessary. So unless we can develop a convenient solution that enables continued queuing or something to that effect, I don't necessarily think that on-port charging necessarily has the best use case. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be done, but it probably will not be the principal point of charging for these vehicles. And one of the lessons learned that we can apply from the consumer fleet over to the heavy-duty fleet is we didn't have to reinvent the wheel in terms of where the charging infrastructure was going. We know where people are going. The interstate system is set. The popular destinations like Tahoe or Mammoth are not moving. And so if we know where the distribution centers are, where the intermodal stations are, we can devise a strategic network that leverages the best use of funds. Or better yet, we know where the truck drivers are stopping. It's at truck stops. So, I mean, we don't have to, this doesn't have to be an NREL exercise, I guess is what I'm saying. It can be, but I think there's some pretty obvious things that we can take a swing at it in the first board that will hopefully do a great deal of good.
Terrific. Okay. On that optimistic note, we're going to wrap up. I think we're right at time. We're actually a minute over. So I want to thank Vincent, Ryan, and Daniel for contributing their expertise, especially Ryan, to jump on a trucking panel when you do buses. Greatly appreciate you sharing the lessons learned. And with everyone, if you'll refresh your coffee or whatever else you want to refresh, and then we'll move into our 1:30 panel. So if the panelists for our next session could come up.